Comrades, hear me now. The world as you know it is not merely unfair, it is deliberately constructed to bind you in chains invisible yet unbreakable to the unawakened mind. From the factory floor to the crowded tenements, from the marketplace to the lecture halls, you are told that your suffering is natural, that your toil is noble, that your subjugation is inevitable. But let us speak the truth. Discomfort is the spark that precedes resistance, and resistance is the first tremor of liberation. Do not be deceived. Capitalism does not tolerate equality. It thrives upon division, upon your isolation, your ignorance, and your internalized acceptance of scarcity. You labor day in and day out, not for yourselves, but for the profit of a class that owns nothing but your labor, a class that extracts from your sweat and your life's hours the wealth it claims as its own. The discomfort you feel, unease at the injustice, the gnawing awareness that the world is not right is no accident. It is the signal of your subjection and the potential seed of your awakening. Understand this, workers, artisans, and all who are enslaved by the market. Your suffering is systematic. It is produced by structures designed to pacify, distract, and dominate you. The wages that barely sustain life, the rising prices that devour your earnings, the endless toil that crushes creativity and spirit, all these are not misfortunes of fate, but the tools of a system that exists to perpetuate its own power. You are made to internalize your oppression, to bear your burden silently, to blame yourself when hunger gnaws and opportunity flees. Yet discomfort is not resignation, it is the call to arms of the mind. The first stirrings of resistance are never heroic. They are quiet, inconvenient, restless, and itch beneath the skin of compliance, a subtle but insistent refusal to accept the unbearable as normal. You may feel discontent without knowing its cause, anger without a target, frustration without a path. This discomfort is the crucible in which consciousness is formed. Marx wrote that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Know this, your unease is the pulse of that struggle, beating within you. To feel discomfort is already to reject the world as it has been imposed upon you, to sense the injustice, to imagine a life not dictated by the profit of the few but by the needs of the many. Comrades, do not waste the fire of discomfort in mere complaint or passive lamentation. Recognize it as a weapon, sharpened by clarity and collective effort. Resistance begins when individuals find one another, when the lonely murmurs of discontent become a chorus, when isolated suffering transforms into organized outrage. This is the moment when the veil falls and ideology becomes visible. The ruling class fears your unity, not your despair. It fears the assembly of the dispossessed, the discussion of ideas, the formation of action. It is essential to understand the mechanism of your oppression, for knowledge is the first stage of liberation. Capitalism is built upon your alienation from the product of your labor, from each other, from your potential. You sell your labor as a commodity, while the capitalist sells the product of your toil for profit. You are alienated from the meaning of your work, reduced to a function, a cog, a number on a ledger. Yet discomfort reminds you that this is unnatural, that you were not born to be mere instruments of accumulation. When you feel that unease, that sharp recognition that life could be different, the first whisper of resistance has arrived. But knowledge alone is insufficient. Discomfort must be transformed into action. History shows that change never comes from the benevolence of the powerful, but from the collective force of the oppressed. Your discomfort becomes revolutionary when it finds organization, solidarity, and purpose. Gather comrades. Unite across workshops, across cities, across industries. Let your shared awareness of injustice crystallize into demands, into strikes, into movements that the ruling class cannot ignore or suppress. Your resistance must be methodical, intelligent, and fearless, for the enemy you face does not retreat without struggle. Do not fear discomfort, for it is the herald of liberation. The trembling of conscience, the unease that stirs your mind in the dead of night, the restless dissatisfaction with the arrangements of wealth and power, all of these are the first steps toward freedom. Marx teaches that the proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains and everything to gain. Discomfort is the awakening, the spark, the first tremor in the bedrock of oppression. And when the masses recognize the power that lies within that shared discomfort, when it is united with action, no fortress of privilege, no citadel of exploitation can withstand it. The lesson is clear. Do not seek comfort in a world designed to deprive you. Do not wait for permission to feel, to think, to rise. Resistance is born in the body of discomfort and takes form in the minds of the united. Today, your unrest is the prelude to revolution. Tomorrow, it is the sound of chains breaking. Comrades, let the discomfort you feel not be ignored, not be silenced, not be turned into resignation. Let it be recognized, understood, and transformed into organized struggle. Let it be the force that drives you to reclaim what is yours by right, your labor, your life, your dignity. History moves through discomfort. History moves through struggle. History moves through the will of those who dare to reject subjugation. Rise, comrades, recognize your discomfort, transform it into resistance, organize, unite, and reclaim the world that has been stolen from you. For resistance, always, begins as discomfort. Discomfort is not a trivial feeling. It is a profound signal that the structures of society are not aligned with human needs, that the system under which people labor and live is fundamentally unjust. It is the tremor that passes through the consciousness of the oppressed, the subtle awareness that the world they inhabit is not natural, that their suffering is neither accidental nor deserved. From the earliest moments of industrial capitalism to the contemporary global economy, the mechanisms of exploitation have relied on the masking of oppression, on persuading workers that inequality is inevitable, that poverty is personal failure, and that the hierarchy of wealth and power is fixed by fate or divine will. Yet discomfort rises within the individual because the human mind and human spirit recognize injustice, even when ideology tries to suppress that recognition. It is the mind's way of signaling that something is wrong, that the alignment of labor, life and wealth is unnatural, and that there exists a potential for change. Workers, artisans, and laborers experience this discomfort daily as a product of alienation. They labor long hours, producing goods and services that they will never own, contributing value to enterprises that belong entirely to others while their own basic needs are barely met. This alienation is not merely material but deeply psychological. The worker is separated from the product of their labor, from the process that gives life meaning, and from fellow workers who might be allies in shared struggle. The discomfort that arises is a recognition of this separation. It is the sense that life is being stolen piece by piece, that hours, energy, and creativity are converted into wealth for another class, while the laborer is left with mere subsistence, exhaustion, and the faintest hope that survival itself is an achievement. This awareness, often vague at first, accumulates over time into a sharper understanding of systemic exploitation. The discomfort of the oppressed is compounded by the illusions maintained by capitalist society. Ideology tells the worker to blame themselves for scarcity, to accept wage inequality, meritocratic, to pursue individual ambition while ignoring collective plight. Education, media, and culture reinforce the notion that dissatisfaction is a personal failure rather than a structural reality. Yet discomfort persists because it is rooted in material reality. The empty stomach, the overcrowded dwelling, the dangerous workplace, and the constant pressure to compete are not illusions. They are conditions imposed by a system designed to extract maximum profit from labor while minimizing compensation. The dissonance between what is taught, the supposed fairness and freedom of the system, and what is experienced, the exploitation, inequality, and deprivation, creates a cognitive and moral tension that manifests as discomfort. It is in this tension that resistance begins. This discomfort is not simply a passive feeling but the precursor to awareness. When a worker begins to question why they toil endlessly while others reap the fruits of their labor, when they notice that hardship is not distributed equally but concentrated among those who have the least power, they begin to understand the structural nature of oppression. Discomfort sharpens perception, illuminates injustice, and prompts inquiry. It fosters a moral and intellectual unease that cannot be easily silenced by ideology, propaganda, or resignation. It is the beginning of consciousness, the awakening of critical thought that recognizes systemic exploitation and demands an explanation for why society is organized in ways that benefit a few while subordinating the many. Yet discomfort alone is insufficient without connection to others who feel the same unease. Isolation is the tool of domination. Capitalism thrives when workers endure discomfort privately, internalizing blame, and competing against one another rather than uniting in shared struggle. But when discomfort becomes collective, when the murmurs of dissatisfaction spread from one laborer to another, the individual spark of unrest can ignite a larger flame. The shared recognition of injustice amplifies the potential for action. It is in this social dimension that discomfort transforms from a personal grievance into revolutionary potential. The worker who feels alone may grumble, but the worker who discovers a network of comrades who share their discomfort begins to see the contours of power, the mechanisms of exploitation, and the paths through which resistance can emerge. Discomfort also functions as a teacher. It forces reflection on the conditions of life, the nature of labor, and the distribution of wealth and power. It inspires questions. Why must some labor ceaselessly while others accumulate wealth without effort? Why must human potential be subordinated to profit? Why is survival treated as an achievement while creativity, solidarity, and well-being are denied? These questions, born from discomfort, cannot be answered by the rhetoric of capitalism. They demand an analysis of social relations, an understanding of class, and recognition of the inherent conflicts between those who own the means of production and those who sell their labor. The discomfort felt by workers is thus inseparable from the intellectual awakening that precedes organized resistance. History confirms this relationship between discomfort and struggle. Every social movement, every labor strike, every act of rebellion begins with recognition, the recognition that conditions are intolerable, the realization that suffering is imposed, and the moral indignation that arises from that recognition. Discomfort is the soil in which consciousness grows, the energy that fuels organization, and the urgency that transforms thought into action. It is the first tremor of revolution, subtle yet profound, indicating the possibility that the oppressed will no longer accept subjugation as inevitable, that they will rise together to demand justice, dignity, and the redistribution of power. Capitalism is not merely an economic system. It is a social structure built upon the separation of people from one another and from the products of their own labor. Its power rests not only in wealth, but in the ability to isolate the working class, to fragment communities, and to cultivate a society in which individuals see themselves as competitors rather than as allies. The very essence of capitalist production depends upon division of labor, division of society into classes, division of the worker from the fruit of their labor, and ultimately, division of the worker from their own humanity. The worker is assigned a function, a repetitive task, a narrow role within a machine of production, and in this assignment, the worker is rendered invisible to the final product. That which the worker produces belongs not to them but to the capitalist, and in this lies the first layer of alienation. One labors, one creates, one sweats and sacrifices, yet the object of one's labor is taken, sold, and transformed into profit that the laborer will never enjoy. The worker's creative and productive energies are thus estranged, producing a world that does not belong to them, and leaving the individual in a constant state of dissatisfaction and unease. This estrangement extends beyond the individual to society itself. Capitalism thrives when the worker is isolated from others who share similar conditions. By encouraging competition, by pitting worker against worker, by emphasizing individual success in the marketplace rather than collective struggle, the system ensures that consciousness of shared exploitation is suppressed. The worker is made to see others as rivals for scarce wages, scarce opportunities, and minimal recognition. Friendships, solidarity, and communal bonds are weakened, and the potential for collective action is stifled. It is only when workers recognize that their isolation is a construct designed to prevent rebellion that the first step toward unity is possible. The capitalist system depends upon the illusion that the worker's predicament is unique, that failure is personal, and that liberation is unattainable. This isolation is deliberate and serves to maintain the dominance of the owning class, which relies not on overt oppression alone but on the subtle fragmentation of society. Exploitation is the heart of this system, the engine that drives accumulation and maintains inequality. The laborer sells their labor power, not the product, for a wage that is always less than the value produced. The surplus, the difference between what is produced and what is paid, is extracted by the capitalist as profit. This surplus labor is the true source of wealth under capitalism, yet the worker is left alienated from its benefits. The longer and harder one works, the richer the capitalist becomes, while the worker remains dependent, struggling to survive. Exploitation is systemic, not accidental. It is not a consequence of greed alone, but a fundamental feature of the system. Wealth for the few is possible only through the subjugation of the many. The capitalist class protects its privileges by controlling not only property but ideology, education, law, and culture, ensuring that exploitation is normalized and disguised as opportunity or meritocracy. Alienation is more than the separation from the product or from others. It is the disconnection from one's own humanity. Labor under capitalism becomes a means of survival rather than a form of self-expression or fulfillment. The worker is reduced to a commodity, valued only for what they can produce, measured only by the efficiency with which they serve the system. Creativity, intellect, and human potential are subordinated to the imperatives of profit. The worker becomes estranged from their own faculties, their own desires, their own capacities for meaningful life. The repetition of monotonous tasks, the enforcement of rigid schedules, and the constant pressure to produce ensure that the individual is conditioned to accept alienation as the natural state of existence. Yet beneath the surface, discomfort simmers, an awareness that life has been devalued, that the worker's labor is stolen, and that human potential is squandered for the enrichment of a small class. This combination of isolation, exploitation, and alienation ensures the reproduction of capitalism itself. The system maintains control not only through economic coercion, but through social and psychological manipulation. By fragmenting society and suppressing solidarity, by extracting wealth without providing corresponding well-being, and by estranging the worker from themselves and others, capitalism reproduces its power generation after generation. The effects are felt not only in material deprivation, but in alienation from social bonds, from meaningful work, and from the sense of possibility itself. Yet the very discomfort caused by this alienation is the seed of consciousness. It drives reflection, questioning, and eventually resistance. The worker who recognizes the structures that isolate them, exploit them, and alienate them begins to perceive the system for what it truly is, not a natural order, not an inevitable condition, but a human construction designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few while subjugating the many. Capitalism's survival depends on the workers' unawareness, on their acceptance of isolation, and on the internalization of alienation. When this awareness grows, when the isolated worker begins to see common cause with others similarly oppressed, the foundations of the system are challenged. Discomfort becomes insight, insight becomes solidarity, and solidarity becomes action, demonstrating that the very mechanisms of capitalism, its isolation, exploitation, and alienation contain the seeds of their own undoing. Awareness and understanding of class struggle are the essential instruments through which the uneasy discontent of the oppressed is transformed into the decisive energy of revolution. Discomfort alone, however sharp and persistent, is insufficient to produce liberation. It is a spark, a signal, a recognition that something is wrong. But without comprehension of the underlying mechanisms of society, it remains mere dissatisfaction, fleeting and isolated. The transformation of unease into revolutionary potential occurs only when the worker or the oppressed individual perceives that their suffering is not a matter of personal failure, moral weakness, or chance, but is instead the product of structured social relations of power, ownership, and exploitation. These relations are grounded in the division of society into classes, a division in which the few who own the means of production derive wealth, security, and influence from the labor of the many, who possess only their capacity to work. To recognize this is to begin to see one's discontent not as private misfortune but as evidence of systemic oppression, and in this recognition lies the possibility of revolutionary consciousness. Class struggle is not an abstraction, it is the lived reality of every worker, artisan and laborer, who toils under conditions that enrich others while denying them dignity, leisure, and opportunity. From the factory floor to the office, from the mines to the fields, the dynamics of exploitation manifest as unequal access to resources, education, and power. Unease arises naturally within this context, a quiet but persistent awareness that the arrangements of society are not equitable. Yet alone, unease can produce only resignation or frustration, not organized change. The leap from discomfort to revolutionary potential occurs when the worker situates their experience within a broader social framework, understanding that the deprivation, injustice, and alienation they endure are not anomalies but systematic features of capitalism. By connecting personal experience to social analysis, the individual moves from passive discontent to critical understanding, from emotional response to informed awareness. Understanding class struggle provides both clarity and orientation. It exposes the source of exploitation and reveals the conflicting interests of different social strata. The capitalist class, which controls land, factories, and capital, has no natural alignment with the well-being of the working class. Their interests are opposed. Every wage cut, every privatization of wealth, every extension of work hours, every restriction of rights benefits the owning class, while imposing additional burden on the laboring masses. Recognizing this inherent conflict allows the oppressed to move beyond illusions fostered by ideology, propaganda, or cultural conditioning. The perception that society is fair, that merit determines success, or that laborers are competing on equal footing collapses in the light of class consciousness. Awareness of class struggle sharpens the mind to see the mechanics of exploitation and awakens the imagination to consider alternatives rooted not in charity but in justice and collective power. This awareness, however, is insufficient if it remains isolated within the individual. Revolutionary potential is realized through the connection of minds and wills, through solidarity among those who share experiences of oppression. Understanding class struggle allows the oppressed to recognize allies in one another, to see that their suffering is common and systemic rather than personal. This connection transforms unease into organized force. Discomfort becomes a shared moral outrage, and shared moral outrage becomes the foundation for collective action. Awareness clarifies objectives. It teaches that liberation is not achieved by individual advancement within the existing system, but by the restructuring of society to place human needs above profit, cooperation above competition, and justice above accumulation. History demonstrates that revolutionary change arises when awareness of oppression combines with action. The discontent of the masses is the latent energy of transformation, but it is knowledge of structural injustice that channels that energy effectively. A worker who understands class struggle sees that strikes, protests, labor unions, and political organization are not optional but necessary instruments in the pursuit of justice. Awareness transforms emotional response into strategic engagement, turning the raw tension of unease into deliberate, conscious effort to challenge and dismantle structures of exploitation. It converts moral indignation into practical measures, creating pathways from discomfort to systemic change. Furthermore, understanding class struggle instills a sense of inevitability in revolutionary potential. The oppressed realize that their conditions are neither accidental nor eternal. They see that every crisis of the system, every economic downturn, Every injustice inflicted by the ruling class is an expression of contradictions inherent in capitalism. These contradictions, once recognized, are not just problems to endure but opportunities to mobilize, to organize, and to act. Revolutionary potential arises from the knowledge that the current social order is contingent, that it can be challenged, and that the collective power of the conscious masses can restructure society in accordance with human need rather than private profit. The transformation of unease into revolutionary potential is therefore both intellectual and practical. Awareness of class struggle illuminates the source of suffering, connects isolated experiences into a collective understanding, clarifies objectives for change, and motivates strategic action. It turns passive discomfort into active engagement, disillusionment into solidarity, and oppression into the foundation of resistance. The worker who grasps the reality of class struggle recognizes that liberation is not granted, it is seized, that justice is not offered, it is demanded, and that revolution begins in consciousness, before it manifests in the streets, factories, and halls of power. Discomfort, no matter how acute or persistent, remains powerless unless it is transformed into collective action. Alone, the individual may feel unrest, moral outrage, or dissatisfaction with their condition, yet isolated unease cannot dismantle the structures of exploitation that surround them. Capitalism thrives precisely because it keeps workers divided, alienated, and distracted. It ensures that each person sees their struggle as personal rather than systemic, that they see their neighbor as a competitor rather than a comrade, and that they internalize blame for conditions over which they have little control. Solidarity, therefore, is not merely a moral ideal, it is a practical necessity. When workers recognize that their discomfort is shared, when they understand that suffering is not an individual misfortune but a feature of an oppressive system, they take the first step toward organized resistance. It is in the assembly of the many, the coordination of voices and efforts, that discomfort is amplified into a force capable of challenging power. Collective organization transforms scattered frustration into directed power. A single worker may grumble at injustice, may feel indignation at exploitation, may rebel quietly in thought or in small acts of defiance, but the isolated efforts are easily absorbed or crushed by the machinery of capitalism. When workers come together, however, the dynamics change. Strikes, protests, unions, cooperatives, and political organizations embody the principle that strength lies in numbers and coordination. They allow the experiences of many to coalesce into a coherent critique of the system and a shared strategy for change. Each individual, by joining a collective, contributes to a greater force that can negotiate, resist, or disrupt the mechanisms of exploitation in ways that are impossible for an isolated worker. Solidarity multiplies the power inherent in discomfort, creating the bridge between consciousness and action, awareness and effect. The process of collective organization also educates. As workers interact, share experiences, and discuss the nature of their oppression, they refine their understanding of capitalism's structures and contradictions. They recognize patterns of exploitation that extend beyond their immediate workplace, seeing connections between wages, conditions, social services, and political policies. In this dialogue, discomfort is no longer a vague feeling but a targeted understanding of injustice. Solidarity nurtures awareness by demonstrating that individual suffering is systemic and that collective effort is both possible and necessary. It teaches strategy, patience, and coordination, ensuring that rebellion is not impulsive or chaotic but deliberate, intelligent, and capable of effecting real change. The shared experience of struggle builds trust and mutual understanding, essential ingredients for sustained revolutionary effort. Collective organization also disrupts the isolation imposed by capitalist ideology. Capitalism relies on the division of labor and the isolation of the worker to prevent the formation of consciousness. When individuals are made to feel alone, their discontent is softened into resignation or displaced into futile competition. Solidarity breaks this isolation, revealing the strength that comes from unity. The knowledge that one is not alone, that many share the same frustrations and recognize the same injustices, is empowering. It transforms discomfort from a source of anxiety to a source of motivation, encouraging risk-taking and persistence in the pursuit of social change. Organized solidarity provides both moral and practical support, reinforcing the belief that systemic oppression can be confronted and overturned. Moreover, solidarity channels discomfort into collective tactics and strategies that have material impact. The isolated worker's outrage may be ephemeral, expressed in words or fleeting gestures, but the organized collective can leverage strikes to disrupt production, protests to demand reform, and political mobilization to challenge laws and institutions. These actions translate moral energy into social force, converting the abstract recognition of injustice into tangible consequences for those who benefit from exploitation. Through organized effort, workers learn that their discomfort is a tool, that their frustration can be disciplined into a coherent campaign for rights, wages, and dignity. Collective organization thus converts emotion into strategy, passion into planning, and recognition into power. History demonstrates that every significant advance in workers' rights, social justice, and political liberation has emerged from solidarity. Revolutions, labor movements, and social reforms are never the product of isolated individuals acting alone. They are born of collective consciousness and coordinated action. Discomfort, when joined with others in a shared struggle, ceases to be a private grievance and becomes a force capable of transforming society. The assembly of minds, the synchronization of efforts, and the mutual reinforcement of ideals ensure that dissatisfaction is no longer diffused but concentrated, no longer fleeting but sustained, and no longer passive but active in challenging the structures of power. True liberation cannot be achieved within the confines of a system designed to extract, exploit, and control. It demands a conscious rejection of imposed structures that subjugate human potential and subordinate life to the accumulation of profit. The laborer, the worker, the oppressed individual is conditioned to accept limitations as natural, to view scarcity as inevitable, and to believe that their existence is secondary to the interests of the owning class. Yet liberation begins when these imposed beliefs are recognized as tools of domination, when the structures of control, the political, economic, and ideological apparatus of the ruling class are seen for what they are, mechanisms constructed to perpetuate inequality, secure obedience, and normalize exploitation. To reject these systems is to assert the inherent value of human life above the dictates of capital, to affirm that labor, creativity, and social cooperation belong to those who produce them, and to reclaim the dignity that has been systematically stripped from the worker. Labor under capitalism is commodified, alienated, and appropriated by those who own the means of production. The worker's time, energy, and skill are sold not for their benefit, but for the enrichment of another class. True liberation requires reclaiming this labor as an expression of human capability rather than as a vehicle for profit. This reclamation is not merely economic, but deeply personal and social. It means reshaping the act of work to serve human needs, to cultivate creativity, and to foster community rather than competition. It is the recognition that work can be fulfilling, that it can produce meaning and sustenance, that it can nourish both the individual and society. To reclaim labor is to assert the worker's right to control their own efforts, to decide collectively how production is organized, and to ensure that the fruits of labor are distributed according to need and justice rather than the arbitrary dictates of wealth accumulation. Dignity, stripped away by systemic oppression, must also be reclaimed. Capitalist society measures human worth in terms of productivity, consumption, and compliance. The worker is valued only insofar as they produce surplus for the capitalist, leaving personal integrity, creativity, and humanity devalued. Liberation requires asserting that dignity cannot be quantified in wages, that it cannot be subordinated to profit, and that it cannot be mediated by hierarchical power. To reclaim dignity is to demand recognition as a full human being entitled to respect, equality, and the right to participate meaningfully in decisions that affect one's life and labor. It is to reject the ideology that normalizes inequality and to insist upon the moral and social legitimacy of every individual regardless of class, occupation, or social standing. Dignity is inseparable from freedom. Without the one, the other cannot exist. Life itself, which under capitalism is subordinated to economic imperatives, must also be reclaimed. Human existence is reduced to a cycle of labor and consumption, with survival treated as the highest achievement and well-being, leisure, and fulfillment considered luxuries for the privileged. True liberation asserts that life is more than survival, that it is not measured solely by productivity or material accumulation, and that the organization of society should serve the flourishing of all people rather than the enrichment of a few. Reclaiming life involves restructuring society so that basic needs, food, shelter, healthcare, education, and freedom from oppression are guaranteed, and so that every individual can participate fully in shaping their world. It requires rejecting the logic that prioritizes profit over human need, and that treats people as means rather than ends. Rejecting imposed system also entails dismantling the ideological apparatus that maintains them. Capitalism is maintained not only through economic coercion but through culture, media, education, and law, which inculcate acceptance, passivity, and internalized subordination. Liberation requires critical awareness, the ability to see through the narratives that justify exploitation, and the courage to envision alternatives. It demands collective effort to construct new systems rooted in cooperation, justice, and the equitable distribution of resources. Individual liberation is inseparable from collective transformation. Freedom cannot be realized in isolation when society is structured to maintain inequality and domination. Finally, true liberation recognizes that the reclamation of labor, dignity, and life is an ongoing struggle, not a singular act. It requires persistent vigilance against the forces that seek to reimpose subjugation, continuous education and organization, and unwavering commitment to solidarity. It demands that the oppressed act, not only to secure immediate relief from suffering, but to transform the very conditions that produce oppression. Only through this conscious, collective, and sustained effort can labor cease to be a tool of exploitation, dignity cease to be conditional, and life cease to be subordinate to wealth. Liberation, in its truest sense, emerges from the rejection of imposed systems, the reclamation of what has been stolen, and the creation of a world where human potential, equality, and justice are the guiding principles. Comrades, the journey from discomfort to resistance, from alienation to solidarity, and from exploitation to liberation is neither accidental nor distant. It is the inevitable consequence of recognizing truth, of understanding the structures that bind us, and of uniting in collective action. Every pang of unease you feel, every indignation at injustice, every restless questioning of why life is organized to serve the few instead of the many, is a signal, a spark, calling you to awaken, to join with others, and to assert your humanity against a system designed to deny it. The path forward is clear. See the mechanisms of oppression for what they are. Refuse the imposed limitations that diminish your labor, your dignity, and your life, and organize with your fellow workers to reclaim the world that has been stolen. Liberation is not granted, it is seized through knowledge, solidarity, and action. Let the discomfort that stirs within you become the fire that ignites revolution, the force that breaks chains, and the energy that reshapes society in the image of justice, equality, and human flourishing.